My mother moved her anniversary party to my wedding day because she thought everyone would choose her. I changed one line on every invitation, and 1 hour later, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My mother moved her anniversary party to my wedding day because she thought everyone would choose her. I changed one line on every invitation, and 1 hour later, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My mother smiled at me across the table covered in white linen and told me she had moved her anniversary party onto my wedding day. She said it the way she said everything important, softly, sweetly, with a small tilt of her chin, as if she were handing me a gift instead of a wound. The candle between us guttered when the server passed, and for one absurd second, all I could focus on was the smell of seared scallops and the sound of ice settling in my water glass, because my brain refused to process what she'd just said as something that had actually happened out loud in a restaurant 3 weeks before I was supposed to marry the man sitting beside me. Everyone will be choosing, she said, and I think we both know who they'll choose. My father lifted his champagne glass. The diamonds on his cufflinks caught the restaurant light and threw it across the tablecloth. Smart girl, he said, and he wasn't talking to me. For a second I heard nothing. Not the clink of silverware around us, not the low hum of the restaurant, not even my own heartbeat. I just felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine under the table. Not panic, warning, he knew my mother. He knew the exact shade of sweetness she used right before she cut someone open in public. You moved it? I asked. Your father and I have been married 35 years, Evelyn Harrington said. That matters. People understand tradition. My wedding matters too. She laughed, soft and musical, the laugh she used at charity galas when a donor said something she found charming and stupid. Of course it does, sweetheart, but people had to choose. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I sat very still because I had learned a long time ago that my mother fed on tears the way other people fed on sugar, and I was not going to be her dessert. But that night, after I drove home and sat alone in my kitchen with my laptop open, something in me went cold and quiet and very, very clear. And that clarity is the only reason I noticed what I noticed 3 days later, buried in an email account that was never meant for my eyes. I should back up. My name is Mara Harrington. I was 33 years old, a communications director for a mid-sized healthcare system in Charleston. The kind of job where you learn to read a room, catch a lie in a press release, and never say the true thing out loud until you have 3 sources to back it. I had been with Daniel Whitmore for 4 years. He was a data analyst for a shipping logistics company. Quiet, exact. The kind of man who alphabetized his spice rack and never once, in 4 years, forgot my mother's birthday, even though she'd spent most of that time implying he wasn't good enough for me. We had been planning our wedding for 14 months. Magnolia House, an old Charleston estate with gardens that felt intimate instead of grand. My grandmother's church reserved for the ceremony. A guest list of 140 people, half of them my parents, friends, donors, and church acquaintances, because in my family, weddings were never just weddings. They were proof of standing. My mother was the special events chair of the Harrington Family Foundation, a charity my grandfather started 40 years earlier that funded a pediatric wing at the Regional Children's Hospital and a scholarship program for first-generation college students. It was, on paper, the most respectable thing our family had ever done. My grandmother, Elise Harrington, still sat on the board at 84, sharp as a blade and twice as unimpressed by anyone's excuses. My father, Robert Harrington, was the foundation's treasurer. He had been for 11 years. I tell you all of that now because none of it seemed important on the night of the dinner. It was just background, furniture, the kind of family fact you stop noticing because you've lived inside it your whole life. The early red flag, the one I didn't understand until much later, came 2 weeks before that dinner. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off a cake topper my mother insisted on approving personally, and I found my father hunched over his laptop at the kitchen island at 10 at night, the light of the screen carving hard shadows under his eyes. He closed the laptop fast when I walked in, faster than a man closes a laptop when he's just checking sports scores. Working late? I asked. Foundation stuff, he said. Boring stuff. Go to bed. I didn't think about it again. Why would I? My father had always been the calm one, the wall my mother's storms broke against, the man who signed checks and nodded at galas and said very little. I had spent 33 years assuming his silence meant steadiness. I would learn slowly and then all at once that it had only ever meant complicity. I did tell my best friend Lena Brooks about the laptop moment, mostly as a joke, because Lena had known my family long enough to find my father's evasiveness funny rather than alarming. Maybe he's got a fantasy football team, she said over drinks that week. Robert Harrington's secretly terrible at fantasy football. I'd pay to see that. We laughed about it. I want to be honest that I laughed about it too, right up until laughing about it stopped being possible. The dinner happened on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Evelyn had already called 11 relatives, cried on the phone with 3 of them, and booked the Fairmont's grand ballroom for what she was now calling a milestone anniversary celebration. Family only, quietly moved up. She told people my wedding had been postponed. She told my Aunt Rebecca that Daniel's parents had backed out of paying for the flowers. She told the church prayer committee I was under emotional strain and needed prayers, not congratulations. I found out about the church comment from Daniel, who found out from his own mother, Susan, a quiet woman from Oregon who had never once been anything but kind to Evelyn, and had been repaid with the label "small town simple" behind her back. I sat on this for one day. I told myself it was nothing new, just Evelyn being Evelyn. A storm that would blow through and leave everyone slightly damp and exhausted, same as always. I told myself I could outwait her. Then the caterer called to confirm a headcount change for the anniversary event and mentioned, almost as an aside, that 8 guests on my own wedding list had already called to ask if my wedding was still happening. My hands went cold holding the phone. That was the moment the rationalizing stopped working. She hadn't just planned a party. She had actively, deliberately, told people mine was canceled. That night, I opened the digital proof of every wedding invitation. I didn't touch the date. I didn't touch the venue. I changed one line, the host line, from "together with their families." Mara Harrington and Daniel Whitmore request the honor of your presence, to Mara Harrington and Daniel Whitmore request the honor of your presence at their wedding, following a private family dispute in which Evelyn Harrington has falsely announced its cancellation. I approved rush delivery to every name on the list, including every relative, every neighbor, every church elder my mother had personally invited to her hastily rebranded anniversary gala. Her phone started buzzing an hour later. By midnight, she had called me 11 times. I didn't answer. Daniel sat next to me on the couch, his laptop open, refreshing our wedding email inbox as the messages piled in. Aunt Rebecca wanted to know if it was true that Daniel's family had refused to contribute. Mrs. Parker from church wanted to know if I needed prayer for my emotional strain. Uncle Glenn said something sounded off and that our grandmother would haunt every one of us if we missed this wedding. She told people you were unstable, Daniel said, staring at his screen. That's her favorite word, I said, for women who say no. My phone kept lighting up. Mom, Dad, Mom, again. Finally a text. You embarrassed me. I typed back 4 words. No, I corrected you. 3 dots appeared. Vanished, appeared again. Then, you have no idea what you have done. I stared at that sentence for a long time before I answered. Neither did you. I meant it as a small, sharp thing. A door closing. I had no idea that night how literally true it was. The next morning, my sister Claire called. Claire was 31, 2 years younger, and had spent her whole life avoiding conflict by quietly agreeing with whoever spoke last, which usually meant our parents. Mom is hysterical, she said, her voice careful in the way it got when she was choosing a side without admitting it. She lied about my wedding. She says you're making her look cruel. She is cruel. Claire went quiet. Then, lower, like she was checking that a door was closed on her end, she said something that had nothing to do with the wedding at all. Mara, do you know anything about the Fairmont contract? Dad's been weird about the foundation account all month. He and Mom had a screaming fight about invoices 2 weeks ago. I only heard part of it. Something about Renata. I didn't know a Renata. I told her I had to go, that I had a wedding to save, and I hung up telling myself it was nothing. Some unrelated grown-up argument about money that had nothing to do with me. I told myself that twice more before I stopped believing it. At noon, a woman from the Fairmont called my cell by mistake, thinking she'd reached my mother. We've had 12 cancellations this morning, she said, apologetic and a little embarrassed. A few guests are asking whether the Harrington wedding is even happening. It's happening, I told her, and it was. And for one clean, satisfying moment that felt like the whole story. Petty mother, petty daughter, 1 corrected invitation, 73 guests reconfirmed by the following Sunday. A story with a tidy shape. It was not the whole story. The whole story was sitting in my father's email account, and I found it completely by accident 2 days later, on the Saturday before my wedding, because his laptop wouldn't connect to the guest Wi-Fi at my apartment, and he asked me to fix it. I am, by profession, a person who reads things carefully. It is the only skill my job ever really required. So when I opened his email client to check the account sync settings, I wasn't hunting for anything. I was just doing what I always do, which is read what's on the screen in front of me. The subject line stopped me cold. Urgent. Form 990 discrepancy. Vendor invoices Q3. It was from someone named Renata Osei. I clicked before I could stop myself, and I have never in my whole life regretted curiosity less. Renata Osei, I would later learn, was a forensic accountant, a CPA with 11 years auditing nonprofit financials for a firm the foundation had hired the year before to prepare for an unusually close IRS review. Her email to my father was 3 paragraphs long and used words like material misstatement and related party transaction and unable to certify, and near the bottom, 1 sentence that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. The invoices from Magnolia Events Group for the Spring Gala, the June luncheon, and the October donor dinner total $61,400 more than the vendor's own records show as received. I need an explanation before Monday, or I have a professional obligation to flag this in my report to the board. Magnolia Events Group. I knew that name. It was the planning company my mother had used for every one of her personal parties for the last 3 years, including, I would learn, my own wedding shower, which she had graciously offered to host and then billed, in part, to the foundation as a donor cultivation event. My hands were shaking by the time I opened the next email in the thread, and the one after that, and the one after that, going back 14 months. 14 months, the exact length of my engagement. I told myself, for about 6 hours, that there was an explanation. Nonprofits are complicated. Maybe it was a bookkeeping error, a reimbursement mislabeled, something dry and boring that a smart accountant would clear up by Monday afternoon. I told myself that while I sat in my own kitchen the night before my wedding rehearsal, forwarding screenshots to Daniel with my hands still not quite steady, Daniel read them twice, at the table, in total silence. The particular silence of a man who works with numbers for a living and has just found a pattern he didn't want to find. Mara, he said finally, this isn't a mislabeled reimbursement. This is 3 years of the same vendor, the same amount pattern, and the same signature approving it every single time. Whose signature? He turned the laptop toward me. My father's. I did not sleep that night. I kept thinking about my grandmother, sitting on that board for 40 years, believing every dollar in that fund went to a hospital wing and a scholarship fund named after her late husband. I kept thinking about the kids in that pediatric wing, the ones whose photos hung in the foundation's newsletter, smiling in wheelchairs and hospital gowns, next to captions thanking donors for their generosity. I got married the next day anyway. I want to be honest about that, because it would make a better story if I'd stormed the altar with printouts. But I didn't. I walked down the aisle without my father, because he'd already shown up at my hotel that morning demanding I fix the invitation mess. And I told him no, and he told me I'd always been difficult, and I closed the door on him without a single word about Renata Osi, because some fights you don't start until you're ready to finish them. My grandmother came. My sister came, and stood up at the reception, drunk on courage for maybe the first time in her adult life, and apologized into a microphone for a lifetime of picking the easy side. I married Daniel under a magnolia tree with 73 guests who had refused to be lied to. My mother sat in an empty ballroom across town with 11 people and a cake for 100. I let myself enjoy that for exactly one night. Then, on Monday morning, 3 days after my wedding, I called Renata Ose myself. She was surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I told her who I was and what I'd seen. Professional ethics meant she couldn't tell me much over the phone, but she didn't have to. Her silence and the careful way she said, "I'd encourage you to speak with the board directly, and perhaps with counsel," told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a rumor. This was already a live wire, and she was standing as far from it as her job allowed. I found my own attorney within the week. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet, though I wouldn't have blamed my mother for wondering. A non-profit compliance attorney named Marcus Feld, a heavy-set, unhurried man in his 50s who had spent 2 decades untangling exactly this kind of mess for boards that didn't want to believe their own treasurer had been lying to them. "Here's what I can tell you in plain English," Marcus said, at our first meeting, spreading 3 years of forwarded invoices across his conference table like a man laying out a losing hand of cards. "If these numbers hold up, your mother didn't just overspend on a few parties. She built a vendor relationship specifically to launder personal expenses through a 501c3. Every dollar that went from the foundation to Magnolia Events Group for an event that was, in substance, a private party for Evelyn Harrington is a potential violation of her fiduciary duty. And your father, as treasurer, signing off on those invoices without flagging the discrepancy Renata found. That's not oversight. Courts call that willful blindness, and sometimes they call it something worse. How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Renata's initial estimate is $61,000 for this year alone, but she told you 14 months of pattern. If that holds for the full 3 years your mother's been chair, you could be looking at somewhere north of $300,000. I sat with that number until it stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a betrayal with a dollar sign attached. I want to tell you I moved fast and clean after that, but the truth is messier. For 2 weeks I did nothing but carry it because doing something meant admitting there was no version of my family left to protect. I watched my grandmother at a foundation luncheon, watched her stand at the podium and thank donors for believing in what we do here, and I could not make myself open my mouth. What finally moved me wasn't outrage. It was fear, sharp and specific. Claire called me on a Tuesday night, whispering again, telling me our father had spent the weekend cleaning up the office, shredding old invoices, moving files onto a personal drive. If he destroyed the paper trail before Renata finalized her report, there would be nothing left to prove but my word against my parents. And I knew exactly how that contest would go in front of people who had spent 30 years believing Evelyn Harrington's version of everything. I called Marcus at 8 the next morning. "He's destroying records," I said. "How much time do we have? If Renata hasn't filed her report with the board yet, we may have as little as 24 hours before whatever's left of the original documentation disappears for good, he said. I'd suggest you get her what you already have today, in writing, and I'll draft a formal notice to the board this afternoon. Once that notice goes out, your father can't quietly fix this. It becomes a matter of record, 24 hours. It was the same phrase Renata had used with my father in her very first email, the one that started all of this. And I understood then that I had inherited someone else's countdown clock without ever agreeing to run the race. My chest felt tight the whole drive to Marcus's office. I kept checking my phone at every red light, half expecting an email from Renata saying the files were already gone, half expecting nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. My hands didn't stop shaking until the second cup of coffee in his waiting room, and even then it was a low, persistent tremor, the kind you feel in your teeth more than your fingers. I spent that day doing 3 things at once, badly. I forwarded every screenshot to Renata with a signed statement explaining exactly how I'd found them. I sat in Marcus's office while he drafted a formal notice of financial concern to the foundation board, my grandmother included, and I called my grandmother directly, because I could not let her read those words cold, from a lawyer she'd never met, about a son-in-law she'd trusted for 11 years. She listened to me for a long time without interrupting, which from Elise Harrington was its own kind of alarm bell. When I finished, she was quiet enough that I asked if she was still there. "I'm here," she said. "I'm just deciding how angry to let myself be, because I have a board meeting in 2 days and I intend to be useful, not hysterical." She paused. "Your grandfather built that foundation so children in this town wouldn't die waiting on a surgery their parents couldn't afford. If Evelyn used that money to buy herself party favors and floral arrangements, I want her name off every document that fund has ever produced. Do you understand me? I don't care whose mother she is. She's your daughter," I said quietly. "She is," Grandmother Elise said, "and I raised her better than this. That is not the same thing as protecting her from the consequences of what she did with what I raised her to be." The board meeting was moved up to Thursday, 48 hours after Marcus's notice went out. I wasn't invited, obviously. Neither was Claire. But Renata was, and so, eventually, was someone none of us had expected. Dana Whitfield, an investigator with the State Attorney General's Charities Bureau, whom Marcus had quietly notified the same day he filed his notice, because a compliance attorney with 2 decades of experience knows exactly which regulator gets nervous about a hospital foundation with a 6-figure hole in its books. Dana Whitfield had, by her own later description to me, seen this movie before, just usually with better disguises. She was in her 40s, a 19-year veteran of the Charities Bureau. Blunt in the specific way of someone who has spent a career being polite to people who lied to her face, she interviewed Renata first, then Marcus, then 2 days later, me. "I want to be clear about something," she told me, sitting across a folding table in a state office building that smelled like old carpet and coffee. "Your mother is not going to prison for throwing a nice party. She's potentially in serious trouble for using a children's charity as a personal slush fund, and letting a treasurer falsify records to cover it. Those are very different things, and I need you to understand which one we're actually building a case around." "I understand," I said, and I did. This was never really about my wedding anymore. My wedding was just the crack that let the light in. The board meeting itself I only heard about secondhand, first from Claire, who'd been allowed to sit in as a family observer since she was, technically, still on good enough terms with our parents to be tolerated in the room, and later, in far more detail, from my grandmother herself. Renata presented first. 3 years of invoices, laid out with a forensic accountant's total absence of mercy, comparing what Magnolia Events Group had billed the foundation against what Magnolia Events Group's own bank deposits showed as received from other private clients, Evelyn among them, under a slightly different account name. The gap, over 3 years, came to $311,000. My father had approved every invoice personally. My mother, according to Claire, tried the version of herself that had worked on every uncle, cousin, and church elder for 35 years. She cried. She called it a misunderstanding, a matter of informal reimbursement, for time she donated to the foundation over the years, time she said was worth far more than any invoice reflected. She looked, Claire said, directly at our grandmother while she said it, waiting for the old, reliable rescue. One board member, a retired pediatric surgeon named Dr. Harold Ames, who had donated his own surgical hours to the hospital wing for 2 decades without ever taking a dime of the foundation's money, reportedly asked my mother a single question before the vote. "Mrs. Harrington, in 3 years as special events chair, can you name one gala, one luncheon, one single event where the guest of honor wasn't you?" Claire said the room went completely silent, and my mother never answered him. It did not come. "Evelyn," my grandmother said in the flat, carrying voice she had once used to silence entire charity luncheons, "your father built this foundation with his own 2 hands after a boy down the street from us died waiting for a surgery his parents couldn't afford. You have spent 3 years stealing from dying children to pay for flower arrangements. I do not care how you dress that up. Robert," she turned to my father, "you signed every one of those invoices, you are done here. Both of you. The board voted that same evening to remove my mother as special events chair and my father as treasurer, effective immediately, and to fully cooperate with the Attorney General's Charities Bureau. Marcus told me later it was one of the fastest, cleanest board actions he'd seen in 20 years of doing this work, mostly because my grandmother ran the meeting like a woman clearing brush from a fire line. The public part came 10 days later, and it came the way these things usually do. Not with a bang, but with a single, carefully worded press release from the foundation's new interim chair, my grandmother, announcing leadership changes and a voluntary, fully cooperative disclosure to state regulators regarding financial irregularities identified through the foundation's own internal audit process. No names at first. Charleston is a small enough city that no names were needed. Within a week, the local paper had them anyway, through a source Marcus assured me was not him and was not me, though I have my suspicions about which board member finally got tired of protecting people who never protected anyone but themselves. By the time the story ran under both my parents' names, the consequences had already started stacking up on their own. My father lost his seat on 2 other boards within a month, quietly, the way country clubs and business associations always move quietly when they smell something they don't want on their own hands. My mother's socialite circle, the 140 women who had spent a decade competing over whose gala centerpiece looked more expensive, went silent on her all at once, the specific silence of people protecting their own reputations by proximity. 2 donors who had personally underwritten the pediatric wing, my grandfather's name still hung on quietly, requested their names be pulled from any future foundation materials until the investigation concluded, a request Marcus told me he'd rarely seen granted so fast. The state attorney general's office confirmed an open civil investigation into breach of fiduciary duty and improper use of charitable assets, with Dana Whitfield's name listed as the lead investigator. Whether criminal charges would follow was, the last I heard from Marcus, still an open question the state was actively deciding, and one I no longer had any say in, and honestly, no longer wanted. My parents' marriage, which had survived 35 years of my mother's storms because my father had always, unfailingly, called them smart, did not survive this. He moved out in September. I know that only because Claire told me, not because either of them called to say so themselves. I went to see my grandmother once the dust had settled into something like a shape. She was in the sunroom of her house, going through old foundation photographs for an archive project she'd started, children in hospital gowns smiling next to donors in evening wear, my grandfather in a photo from 30 years ago, younger than I'd ever really pictured him, cutting a ribbon on the hospital wing that started all of this. You could have looked away, she told me, not looking up from the photographs. Most people do. It's easier. I know. Your mother is never going to forgive you for this. I know that too. She finally looked up. Good, she said. That means you understood exactly what you were choosing when you chose it. I think about that conversation more than I think about the wedding invitations, more than I think about the buzzing phone or the empty ballroom or the 73 guests who chose to believe me over my own mother. The invitation was the spark. It was petty and satisfying. And it is the story I told first because it is the easiest one to tell at a dinner party, but it was never the real fire. The real fire was in an email account I wasn't supposed to see, on a laptop that wouldn't connect to my Wi-Fi, 3 days before I got married, and it is still burning through my family's name in ways none of us have finished counting. 6 weeks after the board meeting, Dana Whitfield called to tell me the investigation had been formally referred, alongside the civil case, to the county prosecutor's office for review of possible criminal charges against both my parents. She didn't tell me what that meant for certain. She told me it meant for now that I should keep her card, and that a grand jury might eventually want to hear from me directly. I hung up the phone, sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd changed one line on a wedding invitation, the same kitchen where I'd first opened my father's email by accident, and I realized I had absolutely no idea whether I was about to become the daughter who exposed the truth, or the daughter who testifies against her own parents in a criminal trial. Daniel found me still sitting there an hour later, phone face down on the counter, and didn't ask what Dana had said. He just pulled out the chair across from mine and sat with me in the quiet, the way he had every single time this family tried to convince me that silence was the price of belonging to it. I looked at him and thought about the magnolia tree and the empty ballroom and my grandmother's voice saying, "Both of you, done here," and I understood, finally, that I had already made the only choice that mattered. Everything after it was just paperwork. I still don't know which one I'm going to be.